Content warning: misogyny, eugenics, slavery, blood, and space vampires. Action, excitement, horror, romance,
thrills and chills,
swords and sorcery,
rockets and ray guns,
a dizzying panoply of the strange and impossible from the darkest depths of the human imagination. What mad universe encompasses such tales as these? Join us as we bear witness to the sweeping sprawl of all the history that never was and all the futures that could yet be. It's adventure as you like it on What Mad Universe? Man has conquered space before, you may be sure of that. Somewhere beyond the Egyptians, in that dimness out of which some echoes of half-mythical names, Atlantis, Mu, somewhere back of history's first beginnings, there must have been an age when mankind, like us today, built cities of steel to house its star-roving ships, and knew the names of the planets in their own native tongues, heard Venus's people call their wet world Sha'ardal in that soft, sweet, slurring speech, and mimicked Mars's guttural Lactes from the harsh tongues of Mars's dryland dwellers. You may be sure of it. Man has conquered space before, and out of that conquest faint echoes run still through a world that has forgotten the very fact of a civilization which must have been as mighty as our own. The tale of Smith's scars would make a saga. From head to foot, his brown and sunburnt hide was scored with the marks of battle. The eye of a connoisseur would recognize the distinctive tracks of knife and talon and ray burn, the slash of the Martian drylander Krug, the clean, thin stab of the Venusian stiletto, the crisscross lacing of Earth's penal whip, but one or two scars that he carried would have baffled the most discerning eye. That curious, convoluted red circlet, for instance, like some bloody rose on the left side of his chest, just where the beating of his heart stirred in the sun-darkened flesh. Hi, welcome to What Mad Universe, the podcast where we look at pulp and the origins of pop culture in sci-fi and fantasy. I'm Adam Prosser. With me is Philip Rice.
Hello. Or howdy, y'all.
Howdy, y'all, sort of.
Kinda. Not really.
Yes, we've got an interesting. This is another one of Philip's choices this time, and it turned out a little interesting because, well, you as you know, we were looking at space westerns last season when we looked at Lone Star Planet. But Philip, you want to explain what happened with these books here, or what we found out about these books?
Yeah. So this is one that I actually wanted to do last season, but I was afraid. Because this is billed as the first space western, and we were already doing A Planet for Texans, or Lone Star Planet, last season, so I thought, we didn't want to double up and do two similar things. But reading this, it's not really a space western.
Yeah.
It's the idea that it is comes from the fact that C.L. Moore, the author of Northwest Smith. We didn't mention that.
Yes.
By C.L. Moore, or Catherine Lucille Moore. She had originally come up with the character Northwest Smith as a Western hero or anti-hero, he's a smuggler, outlaw sort of guy. But she instead wrote him into science fiction stories, which she seemed to have an affinity for. Early on, at least, she mostly wrote science fiction and fantasy stuff. But it's not even just science fiction, because there are a lot of horror elements too. It's like the character is basically Han Solo, but he goes up against Lovecraftian monsters every story.
Yes, exactly. And on top of all of that, there's a bit of a film noir feeling to it a bit. as well. So it really is, in some ways, it's just an insane collision of multiple genres. And it's interesting that it's that way from the start too. When you started reading them, you kind of you told me, oh, it's a space cowboy, but he fights Lovecraftian monsters. And I kind of assumed, oh, well, she probably created a space cowboy and then it evolved into fighting Lovecraftian monsters. But nope, right from the first story, it's straight up H.P. Lovecraft, basically. Cosmic horror. And
Yeah, not quite Lovecraft. There's she has subtle differences, but very much in that vein in terms of the
well,
enemies that he goes up against.
okay, yeah, sorry. The first story isn't cosmic horror. It's a creepy mutant horror, but it's very Lovecraftian. And
Yeah, yeah. Like Lovecraft didn't always deal with gods. Sometimes it was just a monster or something.
right. And but it is, again, it is also love it's what's the one with the two brothers, the Lovecraft story, the castle, Eastwick or
Oh,
something.
Dunwich Horror.
Dunwich horror, yeah. And it's got a bit of that. She definitely likes space vampires, because some
Yeah.
variation of a space vampire appears in something like 5 or 6 of the stories. There's 13 of them, and one of them's just a very short epilogue to the whole series. Um, so as we've already mentioned, it was C.L. Moore, Catherine Lucille Moore, who apparently she started using the initials not because she was a woman writing in the 30s in the pulp uh, venue, but because she had a job at a bank, I believe, and she didn't want them to know that she was writing pulp stories on the side. So she used her initials just so she wouldn't be discovered. But you do have to.
I'm sure people not knowing she was a woman was an added benefit, though.
That's true. Yeah, it was that.
Because it was a very sexist industry, still is, but you know.
Yes, yes, and that is something we'll probably dive into in a bit as well. But yes, I'm sure that was a factor as well. I've always said, like, Lee Brackett went by Lee, uh, which is just ambiguous enough that you could, maybe it's a man,
But
but
even like in modern day, J.K. Rowling went with that apparently because of.
right, yeah. There's a number of authors who are female who still use initials if they're worried about, uh, especially genre stuff, if they're concerned about that. Um, I mean, I don't know if she ever tried to pass herself off as a man, but popular writer N.K. Jemisin goes by N.K. Jemisin. Yeah, it just
Yeah, and in Moore's case, people did assume she was a man. She actually met her husband because he wrote her a fan letter thinking she was a male author.
yeah. Yeah, that's pretty great. It was a fan. Yeah, she got a fan letter and ended up marrying him. That's great. And they wrote stories together too, if I'm not mistaken. Correct? Because
Yeah,
he was
a
also
few
a
of them
writer.
in this collection as well.
Yeah, yeah. He was also a pulp writer. Um, but yeah. So
Yeah, there's C.L. Moore was sort of the basis for the Kira character from that DS9 episode we've discussed a few times.
right. Yeah, she was.
Set in the 50s. Obviously, the times changed, and um, she's a little different. There's a lot of Lee Brackett in her, as we've discussed personally, and the Bashir character is married to her in the sense that she's married to a fellow pulp writer. That sort of means he's sort of based on Kuttner,
Right.
her husband, but he's also very different. He's probably based on other pulp writers as well.
Right.
So it's not a one-to-one thing, but she was definitely a partial inspiration for that character in that episode.
Right. We're talking about the Deep Space Nine episode "Far Beyond the Stars," which is very much a good reference point for pulps in general. But as we said, yeah, they definitely use elements and play around with timelines and stuff, so that it doesn't quite work. But that does give you at least a sense of the idea that because as far as I know, Lee Brackett and C.L. Moore, that's about it for women pulp writers, right? There's no other major ones.
Like big ones, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know of any others, at least.
Yeah, and then like when it comes to the artists, there was only one that I'm aware of, which is Margaret Brundage. Is that her name? She was one of the cover artists. But yeah, obviously, the vast majority of that field were men, and the stories reflect that. I found that sort of with Lee Brackett as well, because I don't know if it's because they were a woman writing in a male-dominated industry, or if it was something the editors were telling them, or what. But there is almost a sort of um, desire to be one of the guys that comes through in these stories. It's very
Yeah. The Northwest Smith stories are very much from the point of view of a man,
right.
character at least. Um, and all the women who enter his life end up dying somehow.
Yeah,
Or they either sacrifice themselves to save him, or in some cases he kills them
or
for
they're
various
evil.
reasons.
They're in many cases they are evil space vampires. So
In many cases, but in at least one, it was she was a link to sort of space extra dimensional goddess sort of thing, like a psychic link, and
right.
he killed her to save himself, basically.
Yeah, yeah. He actually
Like
kills
she was
one.
begging for death, but you can still see a lot of the character is very morally ambiguous, and we'll discuss that. But yeah,
Yeah, it is.
even
Yeah,
more so than a Han Solo type. Like this guy's a real bastard.
yeah, yeah. He. If it was written by a man, you'd be like, "Oh God, what a reactionary tool!" You know, like if you didn't know the author was a woman, you'd definitely think it was like misogynist. But as it comes out, and there's even like in one of the earlier stories, there's like a line where basically Smith is drawn into the orbit of this place where they they're on Venus. There's a part of the civilization of Venus where they breed women to be as beautiful as possible to the point where they get, so beautiful, you can't
They're
even bear
hard
to
to
look
look
at
at.
them.
Yeah.
Yeah. But he also talks about they're bred for beauty. Admittedly, this is the bad guy who's doing this, who says this, but he says as their beauty increases, all their other qualities go away, including conscious and intelligence. And it's like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, a woman's too beautiful. They don't have a morals or brains, basically. Like, again, and this was a woman writing this. It's pretty
Yeah, that
wild.
one was a little weird.
And again, you do kind of feel like maybe she was trying to pander to the audience, and that it wasn't like because it's so relentless. You kind of feel like she's like, this ought to hold those SOBs kind of attitude almost. Maybe.
I don't. I'm not sure. Like it. This seemed like something she wanted to write,
Yeah.
because these themes come
Uh,
up in every one of the Northwest Smith stories, at least.
yeah. Well, it's well, and as you say, there is another character who kind of turns the tables on that. But it's also possible that she saw that was what the editor Farnsworth Wright wanted. What little I don't want to make sweeping statements about Farnsworth Wright, because he's a character. He was the editor of Weird Tales magazines, where most of these were published. That's also where, for instance, the Conan the Barbarian stories were published. What I know of him makes it sound like he was definitely, go for the lowest common denominator kind of attitude. So maybe he had
He was also Lovecraft personally hated him. There's a story Lovecraft wrote set on Venus, and there's lots of like disgusting small animals, including the Farnoth flies, which were named after him.
right,
And there was also a reference to Forrest J. Ackerman, who was the co-writer of one of the Northwest Smith stories.
right.
The Ackmans were another small creature from Venus, so
Yeah, well,
it's kind of funny.
in those cases, I do wonder if that's just because he didn't like editors, because it's like an annoying creature that bothers you all the time. I mean, that
Fair
could,
enough.
and this is H.P. Lovecraft.
And
we're
Lovecraft
talking
didn't
about,
really
too.
like anybody.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So it's kind of you hesitate to say one thing or another in terms of, but I do know that Farnsworth Wright, some of the early Conan stories had uh, a bit more psychological depth to them, which Wright apparently asked him to trim out. Like, there's a passage early on in one of the Conan stories where um, basically he says he describes Conan as essentially suffering from depression, which Robert E. Howard himself likely did also suffer from. So he was just using his own undiagnosed depression and putting it in the story. And Wright basically told him to take that out because it was, I guess, too depressing. I don't know. So it seems like he kept steering things back to just no, blood and babes kind of stuff. So
At the same time, the Northwest Smith stories, as you mentioned in the notes here, there's a strange interiority to them. Like there's a somewhat of an emotional complexity. It's very from
Yeah,
Northwest Smith's point of view, and it delves into some ambiguous emotions and things, which you wouldn't expect from this sort of square jawed type character.
yes, yeah, he's very vulnerable in many ways, and it is interesting that like if he has a redeeming feature, it's that he's kind of a hopeless romantic. Like he gets overpowered. Yeah, he falls in with pretty women, and they usually end badly. It ends badly for them, but you never get the sense that he has any dislike of them, and he really like gets overwhelmed with, oh my god, she's beautiful. Not just like he's horny, but like it's blasting my brain how beautiful she is. I want to fall at her feet and worship her, and like that happens in 3 or 4 different stories where he's just it's a little overwrought how much he
Well, to be
loves
fair, they're also
women.
supernaturally beautiful. So
Well, there's the story where the women are, yeah, explicitly supernaturally beautiful, but there's a certain point where it keeps happening, and you're, yeah, okay, two
yeah,
two of them are supernaturally beautiful. It's true, but then there's a few that, anyway, it's a recurring motif throughout the story that he is not to say he's a sucker for a pretty face is a bit of an understatement. And yeah, he's you could say he's a bit of a himbo too, which is kind of funny. That's actually that second story. The story, it's called Black Thirst. It's interesting because you find out that this entity from beyond the stars has been breeding women to be beautiful, and they do, he does sort of, they become concubines and so on, but he keeps the most beautiful for himself because he feeds on beauty, and literally like as this separate force. And he gets to the point where he's got Smith in his thrall, and he says, and hey, I haven't appreciated male beauty in a while, so you can be my next meal. So it
yeah.
is,
It because usually the descriptions of like the physical descriptions of the book are that he's really tanned and like
yeah.
sunburnt and has scars all over his face, but he's apparently really handsome too.
Yeah, yeah, it's made explicit that he's, and I mean that you can imply from the fact that women seem to fall for him too all the time.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, that's definitely a thing. Like this, it never that moment aside, it never really says he's handsome, but you can tell he is.
yeah, exactly. He's a pulp
Like you
hero.
can see like a young Harrison Ford playing him.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and yeah, as we've now mentioned, he comes off as extremely Han Solo. He's an outlaw. As the final story makes clear, it's clear early on that he basically had to take it on the lam from Earth because he killed a
There's
man.
one story set on Earth in the middle. He goes to New York at one point, but
Oh yeah,
most of
that's
them are
true.
set. Um, but obviously on the run from the law at every point in these
Yeah, it's not
stories.
just Earth. He's an outlaw. He's got the death mark on his head and 12 systems or whatever. But he's yeah, he it is actually weird that there's a story set on Earth because they make a big thing about how much he longs to get back to Earth and how he can never
But
go
I
back to
think he
Earth.
longs for like the rural parts of Earth
Yeah. Yeah,
because he's always dreaming about the green fields and stuff, and
yeah,
the New York scene. It's like New York in the future, so it's
right.
like high walkways and things. You picture like Fifth Element sort of
Yeah. Which is,
scenery.
and you can get around it. You can build a rationale for it, but it is a bit of a shame because it is very. There's a bit of a poignant sentiment to it that he loves Earth. He can never go back to Earth, basically. And in one of the last stories, which is the big crossover story, which we'll get into in a minute, he does actually get sent back into the past, and he's able to go to Earth, and it's wonderful that he's like, I get to set foot on Earth again, which he hasn't been able to do. But it's very much a an outlaw western kind of story. He killed a man in a
Uh,
duel. Had
yeah,
to,
the last story, the Song in a Minor Key, which is just a few pages long, um, sort of deals with his backstory, kind of like by implication. There
right.
was a woman, he killed somebody, and there was a house burning down.
Yeah,
That's all we know.
Yeah, no, it's. I think you're supposed to read that as more or less the classic. I think there are a lot of Western characters who had a very
Yeah, yeah.
similar origin, and that's what it was, except in his case. And then you light out for the territories, except in this
And
case,
they
the
sort of gave a
territories.
similar origin to Han Solo too, eventually. So
That's true. Yeah, that's right. But yeah, the
probably
whole
not
sort of
inspired by this in any way, but
he
it's
killed.
that sort of thing.
It's almost not impossible that I mean, if Lee
Oh,
Brackett
the
was the
original Han
inspiration,
Solo might have been inspired, but I mean, the prequel, the Solo prequel.
right? Yeah. Well, I mean,
I doubt it.
if they're going to Lee Brackett for Star Wars, then it's not impossible he'd also read C.L. Moore, and everyone had thought
Oh
in
yeah,
that
no, I'm
direction.
saying Lucas could have been influenced by Moore, but I'm talking
Yeah.
about the Solo origin movie
Well, but
specifically.
Solo was also written by Lawrence Kasdan, who wrote the original Empire Strikes Back, and who literally would have worked with Lee Brackett. So
Oh, fair enough.
there's a bit of a connection
Uh,
there as well. Anyway,
yeah,
the
I
point
didn't
is,
know that, but okay.
yeah, they're going back to the pulps for sure. Now, this isn't such a radical idea that it had to come from here either. Of course, there's any
Hmm.
number of
Yeah, yeah.
pulp
What I meant was
stories.
it's the similar sort of character archetype that's used commonly.
Yeah, he comes because he's like and as I understand it, she did create him to be a Western character, possibly not even a space Western character, just a Western
Yeah, yeah. It
character.
was a straight up western, and she was amused by when she decided to put him in a sci-fi story.
Right.
Uh, she was just amused because his name was Northwest, and there's no directions in space.
Right, exactly. So
Even
she
though he spends most of his time on planets. Like, there's only one story where he's on a spaceship.
yeah, well,
That sort of
never
happens in between stories, but
yeah.
yeah,
But you don't care about like Northwest has a roaring adventure type connotation which it doesn't have
yeah.
if if you're on Mars.
Oh, also, that's not his real name, obviously. It says even Smith wasn't his real name, so we don't actually know what his name was.
Right. Yeah, they rapidly he's going under an assumed name which they make explicit later on. So he rapidly progresses through three different uh genres to cosmic horror, Lovecraftian horror type stories. And the stories then do get a little repetitive. They do tend to be, Smith is hanging around. He either falls in with a woman who kind of lures him away, or maybe he's off somewhere. Like in one story, he's been shot down by the Space Patrol as a smuggler, and he's in the ruins of an ancient city and stumbles across a woman. There's one where, unfortunately, he signs on with a slaving ship,
Yeah,
and
that was really unpleasant because it was obvious that he, had qualms with it, but he was still willing to do it for money. So
yeah, it's very much like it's pretty clear he's an anti-hero. He doesn't have a strong moral compass. The story does make it clear, like because you will sometimes see old pulp stories that kind of deal with either in the past or in a fantasy world or futuristic fantasy world, and they'll sort of take slavery as it comes because they're it's if it's set in the Roman Empire, you kind of the characters take it for granted. But then when you or in a fantasy world, but then you see it in the future, and it's again they've just transplanted various adventure stories into the future, and there's slavery again somehow. So occasionally you'll see that, and just it's gross, but it's part of the trope. But this is literally them. Moore is saying, yeah, slavery not good, but hey, I need the money, so I'm going to sign on. And it's very much as the people I'm signing on with are bad, and they're going to get their comeuppance. I'm okay because I kind of went, well, I don't know, but I need the money. Therefore, I'm going to, Smith is going to escape punishment essentially. But it's
well, I mean, you could say in all these stories he loses a bit of his sanity in each one. I
yeah,
mean, in a Lovecraftian sense, like all this stuff is obviously affecting him.
true. I'd say he's, he doesn't come off that way. Obviously, there's no real continuity, or, I mean, if there was a continuity, you'd think he'd be able to, figure out not to, not to keep falling into the same situation over and over again. But yeah, I don't get the sense of him ever having been, oh, I've seen things mankind was never meant to
Really? Because
see.
the first story, when he gets trapped by Medusa slash vampire,
Right.
um, and he finds the whole situation both repulsive and exhilarating. And his Venusian partner makes him promise not to, um, if he comes across another one of these, not to go straight for it, because a lot of people do apparently. And he says he'll try, and it implies that he might not be able to resist.
Uh, Maybe, but I mean, this is the Shamblo, as it's called,
Yeah,
and
but I got the sense like there's an addictive quality there or something. So,
well, yeah, I mean, it's she's
and
physically
that
addictive,
sort of
right?
thing affects you.
Like she kind
Doesn't
of,
really come up again, but
well, it implies that she drugs you when she's feeding off of you, basically. So it's
yeah.
more of a that's more of a physical addiction, I'd say. Than, but I mean, yes, he's addicted to danger too. I mean, that's that I'll buy into that. Um,
Oh, we
but
haven't
any
really discussed the sort of setting with the Mars and Venus things.
right. So
Um,
let's yeah,
I just
let's
wanted
talk about that.
they're populated by humans, and it calls them humans. Um, sort of they're different races of humans. As we said at the beginning, the first story um, has a backstory that humans had gone into space in the distant past. So I don't know if it's like a ancient astronauts thing where we populated other planets or whatnot, but
Yeah, the way I would read it, and it's true. She's she's not very she's pretty vague on a lot of the specifics. But one of the stories, the story Dust of Gods, uh, basically implies that humans came from the fifth planet that no longer exists. It was destroyed and became the asteroid belt, and there were gods of the fifth planet, and that they settled the solar system, and all the other humans on all the other planets are descended from them. They certainly seem to all be the same species, even though there's, there, even though he kind of implies, Venusian civilization is millions of years old, and same with Earth and Venus, or Earth and Mars. But yeah,
it also says Venus is a lot younger in terms of it than Earth is, and
yeah, that
Mars is a lot older.
right. That's a classic old solar system trope with the idea that
Yeah.
that as you get closer to the sun, the planets are younger. So Mars is older and Venus is younger than Earth. But so there's usually ancient civilizations on Mars and so on. But in this case, the really ancient civilization was on the fifth planet, apparently. And there were three gods who do reappear at one point, although she doesn't like make a very explicit connection between them. But anyway, so yes, that
Oh,
seems to be the origin
I
of.
didn't even connect them as the same thing necessarily. Maybe
Well,
like a
I think that there were three gods, and you can even say that we see the catastrophe that destroyed them in that story. If you want to, you can kind of link it up in
the
my
moon
mind.
story.
Yeah, the moon story. Um,
Okay.
I
We should.
yeah. Anyway,
Um.
but go back. Let's go back and just flesh out the, as you were saying,
Yeah.
the backstory.
So the Venusians are described as extremely beautiful people. The men look like angels in old paintings, choir boys or what have you. His sidekick is actually a Venusian named Jarl, who's uh, described as looking like a choir boy, but he has sort of black eyes that have an animalistic quality to them.
Yeah.
Um, and there's one story where everybody's being reduced to sort of animalistic states, and Northwest is put off by discovering that Jarl's isn't that different from his normal state.
He's described as the beauty of a fallen angel without Lucifer's majesty, I believe was the line she used, which is kind of a good line.
Yeah, and the Martians, there are two types: the rosy-skinned canal Martians, who we don't see much of, and the dryland Martians, who are sort of leathery-skinned and tawny and that sort of thing.
Right. The singer in the story, I think it's
Oh, right,
the
she
Cold
is.
Gray
Yeah.
God. I believe she's a rosy canal Martian. Yeah. What was it with the dryland
No, no, she
Martians?
was a Venusian.
No. I'm pretty sure she was a Martian. They describe her as having the rosy skin. Um, what one of the women's he meets in this, who's a major character, is one of the canal Martians, and I thought it was her, but maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. but she had a
Uh,
she has a non-human name anyway. It's a little it's a little weird. Um, but with the Canal Martians and the Dryland Martians, how did you read the Dryland Martians? Because they sounded like the least human of the bunch at one point, but then later they're just described as kind of having leathery skin.
um, yeah, that's what I figured. Just humans with leathery skin because they live in harsh conditions.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. For I
Because
guess.
he meets a bartender later on
Yeah.
who's a canal Martian who seems like a normal person. So
Right. Drylander. Yeah. Well. Yeah. I guess maybe I just latched on early on. He describes all the different people from different planets, and I guess it made them sound a little more exotic than the other ones. But anyway, they're all humans and they all interbreed and so on. They're not they're not radically. Venusians are very pale because there's no sun on Venus because it's so cloudy and you never see the sun basically. And
that's a
it's
standard thing. Lee Brackett had that too on Venus.
right,
That they were pale because there's no sun.
right. So yeah, it's kind of the old. So and they never leave the solar system. They kind of vaguely imply that there's farther planets, but it's not clear if she means other solar systems or interstellar voyagers, or if she just means like out like Pluto or something. Because almost
Yeah,
every
because there's also life on one of Saturn's moons.
right,
One of them.
yeah, the Jupiter and Saturn,
Oh,
Jovian and Saturn
Yeah.
moons have life,
It
and
was Jupiter, right?
it was Jupiter, yeah. That's
Okay.
yeah. Most of them, most of the stories are set on either Venus or Mars, with, as we say, a couple briefly set on Earth.
I also got the sense the Werewoman one was set on Earth, but that's sort of a weird one for this collection.
Yeah, I actually don't remember that one very well, but yeah, but one of the most interesting stories in this, we may as well talk about this now. So the other big C.L. Moore pulp character that she had was a character called Jarell of Jouari, who was effectively uh, seems to have been based on the story we read. Basically, what if Joan of Arc was Red Sonja, and she was she's medieval French or late, probably about the same era as Joan of Arc, warrior maiden.
It explicitly says the year 1500. So.
Right, that's about Joan of Arc, I believe, and that seems to be the whole inspiration, is that she's a fantastical version of Joan of Arc. She does more. She's not as politically intertwined, but she goes around, having adventures on her own. Also, she commands an army though, or a small legion anyway, and she's got red hair like Red Sonja. It sounds
yellow
like
eyes, which was interesting.
yeah, yellow eyes exactly, and she is very like, I want to say Conan the Barbarian like, but also Red Sonja like. Bearing in mind that at this point, Red Sonja was also a historical character. She wasn't located in the Hyborian Age in the actual Robert E. Howard stories. That's something the
She
comics.
was French as well, right?
I'm sorry?
She was French as well, or Russian?
She's Russian, I believe, yes.
Okay.
The original Red Sonja is Russian, again, around the same period.
I was thinking of another character of his, Dark Agnes, I think.
Yeah, there's a few medieval era warrior maidens, so that probably inspired C.L. Moore. But yeah, Red Sonja going into a fantasy world didn't happen until the comics later. They kind of repurposed her and just so she could meet Conan, essentially.
And also changed the spelling of her name because it was I instead of a J in the original.
Right. And anyway, but so like just reading the story, she seems like not only a much more interesting character, but more in line possibly with what C.L. Moore wanted to write. It's hard not to believe a woman writer wouldn't rather have been writing this character. So I almost wish.
Well, I like the Northwest Smith stories.
I like them, but it's just I feel, and there are interesting elements to them. But I read that story and I was like, dang, I want to read about this girl,
There's 5 additional stories with that character, I believe.
Yeah. So it like that, as I say, remember this is the mid 30s, so it is actually kind of cool that there's a female warrior character like that in the 30s. But anyway, they cross over with, and so we've already talked about in the Cull episode, Exile of Atlantis, we talked about how Robert E. Howard engineered it so that Kull and Bran McMorn, who at the time were his most popular characters, he hadn't created Conan the Barbarian yet. They were able to cross over with each other. As I recall, Kull basically summons one of his ancestors to help him win a battle, and it turns out to be
Bran McMorn.
Bran McMorn, who's a historical Celtic warrior, summons Kull, who's a fantasy warrior from an antediluvian era, into the present, or his present, to help fight this war, and they're allies. The interesting thing about the story with Northwest Smith, a wizard is fighting Jarrell, and says, "I'm going to go find someone to beat you, someone who can beat you." So of course he leaps far into the future and and calls up an outlaw space cowboy to fight her, and brings him back. And it's very Marvel Comics. That's the hilarious part of that one.
Yeah, they fight for a bit, then they're mates, I think is the phrase.
Yeah, exactly. It's classic. I think this basic plot structure was literally used for Marvel Comics at some point or another, because it's always, some bad guy tricks one of the heroes to fighting his own arch nemesis hero, and then for a while, and then they figure it out and they team up and fight the wizard or bad guy. In this case, it's a wizard. And I'm sure there's been wizards who've done this in the Marvel universe, but it feels so much like a Marvel comic. It's quite hilarious. And this is 34, 35, whatever it was. What is it? 37, I'm sorry. But yeah, it's straight up that. So again, you feel like C.L. Moore is not necessarily the most influential writer, and yet you read that and it's hard to believe, Stan Lee wasn't taking notes anyway, right? So
yeah.
Who knows?
So I wanted to discuss one of the stories called Lost Paradise.
Mm-hmm.
Another sort of time travel thing through mental stuff, where Northwest finds himself transported to a civilization on the moon that had arrived there from elsewhere, and the only reason, and it was like a paradise, but the only reason there's atmosphere, because the moon's not big enough to hold an atmosphere, was because these three gods were keeping in place, and they demanded a sacrifice every year. And the sacrifice had to be willing, absolutely willing. And but in this case, Northwest Smith was in the sacrifice's mind, and he wasn't willing to be killed. It results in the death of this civilization. So
right.
It's sort of his defining character trait. This guy wants to be alive. Beyond anything else. Unlike other characters, Han Solo or whatnot, he doesn't have that sort of he's willing to sacrifice himself sort of thing. Northwest Smith is, at least deep down, very what's that scale of hierarchy of needs thing?
Maslow's
yeah, he just wants
hierarchy of needs.
Yeah.
Well, I would argue that he is Han Solo-ish in that he will, right from the first story, it's I step in and I save this woman who's being hunted by an angry mob, which is the right thing to do in that situation. There's no getting around it. So he's definitely not a guy who just only looks out for number one. But I'm saying, when it gets right down to it, he's not willing to sacrifice himself. Well, in that particular story, and it is very interesting to me, because what the situation is that Smith and Jarl, and it's actually Jarl who gets the plot going, they find a mystery man from an ancient race, and it's this same race of people that used to have a civilization on the moon. Jarl knows enough about them, even though they're mysterious, to basically say, "I'll get your box that's been stolen from you back if you'll let me in on the secret in the name of Whisper, Whisper, Whisper." And you never find out the name, but he knows the name of this guy's deity. And they rescue the box, and the guy's like, "Okay, well, it's an important thing, so I'll do it. And I did swear, so I'll tell you the secret." And this is what he does. He takes them back in their mind to the ancient civilization that they had. But he makes it clear that he's going to kill them once he's told them this, and then kill himself, because he has to guard the secret. They're sworn to guard the secret, but he's also sworn to say, "Yeah, I have to tell you the secret because I swore I would, but then I'm going to kill you." So in a sense, it is kind of self-preservation on Smith's part, that back in the vision, he's able to sort of plant a seed of unwillingness, which destroys the civilization, which is sort of, so it's very much a grandfather paradox kind of thing. He creates his own, this guy sending it back created the destruction of his own race, his own civilization, which they've been mourning for all these years, and that's basically what prevents him from killing them when they
Yeah,
get back.
the man does say that Smith wasn't actually responsible. It
Right.
was just sort of a unfortunate twist of fate on everybody's parts, and
Yeah, exactly. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, and all Smith did was say, "Hey, I don't want to die," and that's enough to destroy the entire civilization. Apparently,
but
just the
still,
fact.
there's a thought process in that section where he knows that this is going to happen, but he's not willing to let go of his life.
Right. Well, which
So I mean, it's morally ambiguous, and I like that, but
yeah, that was one of the more
it's
interesting
also not
stories.
straight up hero stuff.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of an extremely awkward situation to be in, essentially. And he isn't even the one who asked to find out the secret, right? It was Jarl who asked to find out the secret, and
And
Smith just
Jarl
kind of.
doesn't learn anything.
Yeah, exactly. The irony is that he doesn't actually keep his oath because he tells Smith, but not Jarl, and Jarl was the one who wanted to find out. So technically speaking, but yeah, I like that. It's kind of a time loop paradox story, which is kind of interesting. As I say, several of the stories are pretty repetitive, but three or four of them are rather clever and interesting, I think.
I
Uh,
think more than that, but yeah,
yeah. Oh, they're
there
well.
was a certain degree of repetitiveness, but I did like a lot of the visuals and stuff
Yeah,
that she describes.
she's got cool imagery. The one where he goes in Scarlet Dream, which is him trapped inside a dream. He bought a shawl with a weird pattern on it that sucks him into a dream which he can never escape from. And it is very dreamlike. It is very hypnotic and surreal because it's this world, and the people who live there have to gather at a fountain and drink what's implied to be the blood pouring out of the fountain. It's the only thing that will feed them in this world.
It's not just
It's
implied; it is blood. It says it.
Yeah, okay. I didn't see it actually say blood, but maybe I. It's just very, very, very strongly. It's a scarlet fluid, and it's gross and so on. But yeah, it's
No, it says it explains why her lips tasted of blood.
right. Yeah, fair enough.
And
It's
there's also grass that if you stand on it too long, it pricks you and starts drinking your blood.
right, which is a recurring thing because the Jovian moon also has living vegetation that tries to tear you up if you push through the jungle.
Yeah,
Uh,
not really any creatures in these stories, unfortunately.
yeah,
Um, doesn't describe any like Martian wildlife or anything.
right.
So
I think at one
that's
at one
that's
point
something she sort of shared. Oh, sorry.
At one point, he describes the spider women or the spider gods or something.
Yeah, it just mentioned offhand, but
Yeah,
that could be anything.
right,
Um, but it's sort of something she has in common with Lee Brackett, who also she had a few animals, but for the most part,
right.
mostly just human focused.
Which is that's the thing with the pulp of this era. It was not big on
Not
world building in many ways.
not necessarily. Edgar Rice Burroughs was very good at that.
Um, I guess even
He had
then,
lots of animals.
well, okay, fair enough. They'll have animals or whatever. I'm just saying he'll only give whatever details are needed for the story, and if it's not part of the story, it won't get fleshed out. Because like thoats and things are part of the story. They need Martian steeds and so on. Whereas you know, which is
I
ironic.
guess it depends on your definition, but I feel those are pretty well fleshed out in terms of the ecosystem. But
Sure, fair
anyway,
enough. But yeah, it is definitely like you realize in these stories, it's just humans, humans, humans. They're all humans. Everybody on all the different planets are humans. They have millennium, as she always says, millenniums old civilizations, and but they're all humans and they're all the same species. And it again, the implication is that they came from this lost planet from a long time ago. Anyway, it's
life here began out there.
yeah, exactly. So as you can see, this has been. I mean, obviously, uh, even just the whole Atlantis myth and the antediluvian civilization thing was in pulp for many years before that. So why not transfer it to outer space, as with everything else about this story? Um, anyway, it's
I would recommend these stories. Like you said, there's a bit of repetition there, and there's absolutely no reason to not just take one out of context and read it. It works fine on its own.
right. Yeah,
Any one. So
I'd say read one or two. Read Chamblot, read Lost Paradise, read Quest of the Starstone, and who knows, maybe we'll come back and read the Jor-El stories, because I kind of want to read more of those. I want to learn more about her. But yeah, they're very...
yeah, I got a copy, but I didn't have time to read the 5 stories this week. But
Yeah. That's fine. Like I
I
said,
was interested.
yeah, maybe we'll have a look at them. But yeah, she's it's interesting because she has some very good turns of phrase. Her writing is very good at parts, but then there's some parts where I thought it wasn't good. I think she's a little bit she goes on and on and on. It's the
It's a
classic
bit purple,
thing
but
right, very purple, and possibly because she was being paid by the world. And in the same,
I felt there was a certain degree of sort of, I think it's been described as like a sensuality to it. It's very it describes how things feel and how they smell, and
right.
that's not common with this kind of writing.
Well, yeah, no, it's when she's on, it works very well. She's got a great texture and a great feel, and like I say, very dreamlike feel to some of what she's writing that makes it very hypnotic. And she's clearly influenced by Lovecraft. Like, it's the Lovecraft feel. That's the other tie to Lovecraft, is his use of of words to kind of draw you in and create atmosphere. She does the same thing. I feel like occasionally she goes, like, as I say in Black Thirst, as she has to keep accelerating the descriptions of how beautiful the women are as he keeps going to the next level, it starts to get a little silly in my mind. Like, she has to keep ramping it up more and more. And there's a few bits where I feel like, I don't know if it was the deadline or something, it felt it didn't click quite as well as it would. But there are definitely passages where it works very well to me. So she can definitely turn a phrase when she wants to. But yeah, which again, and it is purple in the classic pulp fashion, basically.
Yeah, so she later on wrote. She sort of gave up science fiction and fantasy after a while.
Yeah.
Even though it seemed to be her preferred genre, at least early on. She wrote for some TV shows later on, did some screenplays, but seemed to stop writing altogether when she married her second husband after Henry Kuttner died. And he seemed to be... there's not a lot of information on this guy, but he seemed to be not very supportive of her writing.
Yeah.
Because she stopped when she married him. And later on, she was going to be awarded the title of Grand Master of the Science Fiction Writers of America, and he said that it would just upset her because she was suffering from Alzheimer's at the time.
Right, and that would have made her the first.
I don't want to cast aspersions on him. Maybe that was true, but you get somewhat of a feeling he wasn't very.
Yeah, that it was kind of, you're done writing, and to be clear, that would have made her the first. Female Grandmaster of Science Fiction if they'd given her that title. So that is also a notable milestone for her as well. But yeah, she basically she did talk about writing still, apparently, by the 70s. So
yeah, she was a member of all sorts of discussion groups and stuff.
Right.
That sounds like she was online.
Well, she was definitely at conventions, so she wasn't completely
she
cut
would
off.
have been online if online had existed.
Right. Yeah, she wasn't cut off from the science fiction community, for sure. And she must have been known, and again, that was sort of, especially the 70s, that was kind of the era when everyone kind of got back into the old pulp stuff, late 60s and 70s. But yeah, she didn't really produce anything after 63. So her heyday is the 30s. And she was pretty good. So they're, not necessarily the first female pulp author, but probably the first major female pulp author of American sci-fi and fantasy. Well, we've rode hard and experienced horrors unnameable, so it's time to find a dryland saloon, shake off the red dust of the Martian Trail, and drink Sigir whiskey to still the nightmares until we pass out asleep. We are the Space Outlaws Extraordinaire, Adam Prosser and Philip Rice, and if you like the show, we'd be mighty grateful if you'd subscribe to our Patreons. That's under Philip Rice or Adam Prosser at patreon.com, or go to Never Sleeps Network /series/what-mad-universe for the links. We know money's tight all around, so if you can't subscribe, you can also help us out by leaving a review on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or your podcatcher or podcast app of your choice. Or just tell a friend or link to us on social media. You can follow us for news and updates on WMU Podcast on Twitter, or the two hosts individually are at SpearHalfFalk_ for Phil, or Prankster36 for Adam. We also have Facebook and Tumblr pages. Once again, it's all at Never Sleeps Network /series/what-mad-universe. Thanks once again to our partner in crime, Alex Ross, and the singing cowboy from beyond space and time, Jack Feerick, for writing the theme song. Happy trails to all of you, and stay away from the unknowable void of existence.